Welcome, y'all. Today we are going to go into a hot take on Wheel of Time, which is that I think this TV show is going to be as big as Game of Thrones. And my reasoning for it is basically that our culture is ready for it, that fantasy fans who are more into films and TV but don't read the books are itching for something like this. And I'm just going to get into it. So, really quick rundown of what Wheel of Time is if you're not familiar. So, first of all, the Amazon show just dropped on November 19th, the day I'm filming this. I haven't watched them yet. The first 3 episodes are out, but I haven't watched it because I'm going to binge the hell out of them, and I don't have time for that tonight. But I do have time to film this video. So, it's a really big series, 14 books. I have all of them here. We have our old school ones with like some cool art, well, ranging from cool art to like terrible art. I don't know how the biggest series of the time got such horrible art made for it, but whatever. We also have the modern printing with like its boring graphic design where everything looks the same but in a different color. But, you know, even though don't judge a book by a cover is just not realistic when it comes to books, it's... You know, if we're judging a book by its cover, there's a mixed bag here. But anyways, it's a 14-book series, 15 if we're counting the prequel, which is only like a third of the length of the rest of them. These are generally like 600 to 800-page books, so they're big boys. But yeah, so in terms of epic fantasy, which, so for those who don't know, genre is generally a big muddy mess where everything's kind of globbed together. But generally speaking, epic fantasy is when it takes place in a different world, whereas urban fantasy is it takes place in our world, but here's some magic. So for that reason, I'm only focusing on epic fantasy in this, and I won't be talking about Harry Potter or DC or Marvel, which are hugely popular urban fantasies. So in terms of epic fantasy series, I think the 3 most well-known are A, Lord of the Rings, because duh, it's Lord of the Rings. Everyone knows about Lord of the Rings. 2, Game of Thrones, which was huge, had a ton of buzz about it until the ending, which was just terrible, and left a lot of people really upset and wanting something new. And then number 3 is The Wheel of Time, in my opinion. This is not what I think are the best of all time. That might be a separate video down the line, maybe, who knows. But in terms of just the most well-known, I think it goes Lord of the Rings, number 1, number 2 is Game of Thrones, and number 3 is The Wheel of Time, which is generally considered the bridge between classic fantasy, which is like Tolkien and everything else that was trying to be like Tolkien, and then modern fantasy, which includes Game of Thrones. It includes a ton of other stuff that branches off into their own subgenres and really move away from the classic Tolkien-esque fantasy. And Wheel of Time is largely considered that bridge, and I think because of that, it has a lot of the best qualities of both, and I think it also avoids, especially with the TV show, I think it avoids the biggest pitfalls of both. So let's just get into it. Lord of the Rings. I love it. I'm not trying to piss off the fan base, but I do have some criticisms. So first of all, let's get into what is awesome about Lord of the Rings, what makes so many people fall in love with it, which is the sense of awe and wonder, the sense of scope with it. Like, there's so many times in the books and in the movies, which are fantastic adaptations, where it's just jaw-dropping. Like, the first time you see Minas Tirith or something like that, it's just like, oh my god, that's just so cool. So it has that sense of awe and wonder that Lord of the Rings does. Like, there's some really cool set pieces. There's a lot of awesome magic stuff, which I think really will flesh out a lot of the things that people are looking for if they want the sense of awe and wonder, because Wheel of Time does have that. And what we've seen in the trailers for the TV show, they really are doing that justice with just the way a lot of these set pieces are set up. Also, let's get into, I think, the biggest weakness of Lord of the Rings, which is it's not very inclusive. Sorry, y'all. You can still enjoy Lord of the Rings while having this criticism of it, but it's really not very inclusive. All of our main characters are white dudes. We have, like, 3 characters that are women: Galadriel, Arwen, and Éowyn. Galadriel is largely just known for being really beautiful. and Wise too, but it's mostly just like, oh, look at her beauty. Arwen spends most of the narrative pining after Aragorn. Especially in the books, they did a bit better in the movies with it, but that's still her main focus in the narrative is Aragorn's love interest. And Eowyn, who actually does some really cool badass stuff in the third book, but until then is largely just pining after Aragorn. So tons and tons of characters, only 3 characters that are women. It's not super inclusive. Also, there's like no characters that are black or brown or not white. And let me just back up a little bit and say that I know some women who love Lord of the Rings. I also know some women who couldn't get into it because there was no one that looked like them. I know some black folks who love Lord of the Rings. I also know some black folks who couldn't get into it because there was no one that looked like them. It's a mixed bag. No one group is aligned on any one issue. It's just, these are the facts. It's not very inclusive. Still cool. Still love it. Not very inclusive. So yeah, Wheel of Time has that sense of awe and wonder, but it is a lot more inclusive. I'll get to that after I talk about Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is really cool. It really is not so focused on the awe and wonder. It's much more focused on the human experience and these really flawed characters getting, making mistakes and facing consequences and overcoming these consequences sometimes. And it's really just grounded in humans doing human things. It's also really dark, which I'll get to in a second with Wheel of Time. And it is also more inclusive. We do have a ton of characters who are women, but that being said, we have very few characters who aren't white. And it is heavily Eurocentric. I mean, Westeros is basically Europe, but fantasy version. And Wheel of Time is even more inclusive than that. I think the one thing that Lord of the Rings is really inclusive of, or the 2 things they're really inclusive of that Wheel of Time might struggle to compete with is ableism. Tyrion is just really, really well done as a representation of a character overcoming ableism and or not necessarily overcoming, but facing it and still having tons of agency and doing cool stuff, and being like one of the most memorable characters in the books and TV show. And then there's also a good amount of LGBT plus representation in the books and TV show. And Wheel of Time doesn't have a ton of LGBT plus representation. There are insinuations of it, which they can definitely flesh out more in the show for the sake of including more people, because the more people who can see themselves represented in the work, the more people can enjoy it and get into it, and it'll be big. I really think this is going to be big. So, the main weakness of Game of Thrones. The series hasn't been finished. I don't think he's ever going to finish the series, to be honest. I mean, he already got rich and famous off it. Like, I think he's just tired of it. I also know he's what's known as a discovery writer, where he makes it up as he goes. And at this point, near the end of the series, he has tons of threads to pull together and figure out, and that's probably pretty tough. It doesn't change the fact that I'm kind of upset we're never going to get it finished, and I think the TV show the ending was so terrible because they didn't have his work to adapt. And the showrunners clearly had no idea how to tell a story without adapting Martin's work. So, Wheel of Time does have this human element. It is very much about these human characters who are very flawed and morally ambiguous at times, overcoming this human experience, going through this human experience. And at the same time, I think the TV show can make it very dark and gritty. It's not nearly as dark and in terms of the books, nowhere near as dark and gritty as Game of Thrones. I don't think the TV show will be as dark and gritty as Game of Thrones because there's not going to be tons of rape scenes and stuff. I don't really want that, to be honest. I don't know who does. But, in the books, this is a point brought up by Daniel Green, who's a really popular fantasy YouTuber, covers books and stuff of different mediums. But he was talking about how in the books, there's really messed up stuff going on, but your eye is kind of drawn away to like the, pretty language used to describe all these different sword moves, as opposed to like the fact that people are getting gutted and there's blood everywhere and stuff like that. the TV show can lean further into those darker elements. And I think that will deliver for what people are looking for. I think Game of Thrones fans or X fans are looking for something that will fill that void, something that is fantasy, something that captures their imagination, but also is really focused on these human characters who are flawed and who we can root for, who we can really get into. And also, Game of Thrones or Wheel of Time is more inclusive in terms of race. So in Wheel of Time, people largely discriminate based on nationality, not skin color. This is something we see a lot in fantasy. It's something I used in my book, is basically like theorize, oh, well, if people discriminate based on this other thing, then blah, blah, blah. So in this, there's tons of different nations, super fleshed out cultures based on, down to how they speak, what they eat, how their culture functions, how they govern, all this stuff. And within this, since they discriminate based on nationality, we can kind of ignore race. Now, I do need to draw attention to the fact that, like, in terms of the book covers and fan art, everyone's always depicted as white. That's not actually the case if you look at how characters are described. A lot of them are described with darker hair and darker skin and curly hair, stuff like that. And the TV show really leaned into that. Like, if we look at the cast, we see a lot of, like, biracial and people who are not white represented being our main characters. I think this casting looks fantastic. I can't wait to see them on screen and see how it really plays out. So if we're going to ignore the covers and focus on the descriptions and focus on what the TV show did with it, it's a lot more inclusive racially. And once again, tons of characters that are women. In fact, Wheel of Time is like pretty much every culture within it is matriarchal. And I'm not really going to get into spoilers for that, but there's a reason for it. It's justified within the narrative fully. And there is a big focus on gender and just gender dynamics within that. And I think with everything going on in our world, in terms of just kind of various social movements, I think a fantasy show that includes non-white folks is characters with a lot of agency and power within the story, and a lot of women with agency and power within the story. I really think the inclusiveness is going to bring a lot of people to the table who can enjoy it because they see themselves represented. And hopefully the people who are already represented in this stuff don't get all upset that there's non-white people and women who are in these stories. Sometimes they do. This is the internet after all. But that being said, it has the awe of wonder of of Lord of the Rings, the inclusiveness that we see moving away from that, maybe even a little more inclusiveness. It has the heavy focus on the human experience. The series has been finished, which is great, and lastly, Game of Thrones brought a lot of new fantasy fans into the fold. People who maybe weren't as huge fans of Lord of the Rings, or people that were but just were looking for something new. And those people are looking for something to follow up, something to fill that void of an awesome epic fantasy TV show that will really capture their imagination and get them into it. And I really think Wheel of Time will be that. So that is my weird hill to die on. I appreciate y'all sticking around for this video. If you made it to the end, I would love it if you subscribed. It really helps me just kind of put out more videos and spread, more weird takes, especially about writing across different mediums and bringing in stuff with, what's going on with the world and all this different stuff. Subscribing would be awesome. I would appreciate it. And either way, I would love to know what you think in the comments. Do you agree with me? Like, what are your takes on that first episode? What are your takes on Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, whatever? I want to hear your opinions. It's a lot more interesting when it's a back and forth as opposed to me just talking to a camera. So all that being said, I appreciate y'all, and I will catch you in the next one. Peace.